As we learn these personal endings, there is a tendency to want them to reveal themselves completely every time. But that's just not the way it is, unfortunately. Really, a better way to think of it is these four quadrants, these four sets of personal endings, are shapes that you learn to recognize. And we'll see that they change a little bit depending on the verb that they attach to and the tense and some different things like that. But you still will be able to recognize the basic shape. So to illustrate this, I have here with me a rake and a stool and a person. And you can't see them, can you? Because they're, of course, covered with blankets. But I'll bet by the shape you could guess. So which is which here? One of them's moving a little bit, so that's probably alive. I don't know. This one has a round, sort of this round shape on top. So let's guess stool, and ding ding, big surprise, you got that right. Between these two, which looks more human to you? And this would be a very strange Frankenstein sort of looking human, and of course it's not. This is the rake, as you would expect here. And then the last one here, as we look over here, what would you guess this is? Probably human. Oh, yes, it is human. Very unhappy human because I messed up her hair. That's a human. See, you just recognize the shapes. So today we will see a way that these personal endings take on a slightly different looking shape. And what we'll be looking at is something called contract verbs.
Wow.
Now, they're called contract verbs because there is a contraction, a coming together of two vowels. The end of the verb stem ends in an alpha, an epsilon, or an omicron, and when they're attached onto the personal endings, well, we just have too many vowels, so the vowels come together into a single new sound, and it winds up looking a little bit different. The three typical verbs that are used here to demonstrate contract verbs are, first of all, an alpha contract verb that everybody knows, agapao. I love, right? Agapao. Do you hear the alpha on the end before the personal ending, the omega? Agapao. The second one, an epsilon contract verb, is poieo. Do you hear the epsilon there? Poieo. So the stem ends in an epsilon, and then we attach the personal endings onto that. And then the omicron contract verb is pleirao. Pleirao. So it has an omicron and then the personal endings. Okay, now let's just think a second. Let's take poieo, I make or I do, okay? And let's attach the personal endings. Now, if we just leave the vowel there as it stands, it would sound like this. Poieo, poiees, poiee, poieamen, poiete, poieusi. And you can see how awkward that is, especially with the double epsilon, poiete, or something like that. So here's what happens. The vowels come together and contract into a new form. And what we have instead is, instead of poieo, we just have poio. Instead of poiees, we just have poies. Instead of poiee, we have poie. Instead of poieamen, we have poiumen. Instead of poiete, we have poiete. And instead of poieusi, we just have poiusi. So you can see that these vowels are coming together and contracting into a new form. So the connecting vowel stuff looks a little bit different with the contract verbs. Let's take a look at how this happens. We'll see that there's actually a very technical, clear way that the vowels come together and how certain things happen. But it won't be as important for us to memorize all of this, although we need to have some awareness. The more important thing for us to be able to do will be to recognize the shape. When you come across a contract verb, you just need to understand, oh, that's a contract verb. That's why that ending looks a little strange, a little mangled around to me. So that's the key with the contract verbs. So let's take a look. Let me show you what I mean about these shapes here. Before we talk about the rules by which these vowels contract, just look at these alpha contract verbs, and I'll bet you could figure out which primary active endings are being attached even though you don't know all the rules of contraction. Okay, these vowels are a little strange, but look at agapo would obviously be I love. Agapas, well, that's the sigma ending, so that's the second person singular. You love. Agapomen, any guesses? Looks like almond, right? Weird things happen to the vowel because of the contraction, but still we see that first person plural ending. It means we love. And if you saw agaposi, what's that look like? Well, obviously, usi, right? So that means they love. Take a look at poieo, which means I make or do. Notice here, poieo, this is how it will be listed in the lexicon, okay, to show you it's an epsilon contract verb. But the epsilon doesn't, when you say I make or do, you don't say poieo, you just say poio, okay, because the epsilon goes away. This is just for the lexical form to show you that this is an epsilon contract verb, okay? And you also might notice something else here, that poio, well, that looks exactly like the first person singular, primary active ending, except now we have this circumflex on the top. And you might have noticed this about the contract vowels. You have this circumflex over. I think of it as sort of like a little mushroom cloud or something. It's something came together and there was this explosion, all right? Poi-a, which ending would this be? Well, clearly third person singular. He, she, or it does. So, but the only difference is this circumflex. How about this? Poi-umen. Obviously, first person plural. We do. And poi-eta is the contract here of eta plus the epsilon becomes poi-eta. You, y'all do. Here is the verb pleirao, which means I fill or fulfill with the primary active endings attached. Okay, you can see it looks strange to us, but it's not that strange. Pleirois, any guesses? Is second person singular. You fill. Pleiroi, that's the A form here. So he, she, or it fills. Ute, like eta, right? So second person plural. And usin, they fill. Shapes, shapes, shapes. Here are the rules for vowel contractions. Now don't get too worked up about this, worried, oh no, I'll never memorize all this. Again, most important is seeing the shapes, but I do want to show you how this happens and give you some specific examples so you can see. But okay, when you have an omicron, omicron, omicron epsilon, or epsilon omicron, those will turn into omicron upsilon. Any other vowel than epsilon plus an omicron or an omega becomes an omega. Mounts calls this the big bully rule, but omicrons and omegas tend to swallow things up, except for epsilons and themselves. See, they can't swallow themselves up. So anyway, okay. Over here, let's look at this. Epsilon, epsilon will be converted to epsilon iota. So becomes a. Alpha epsilon becomes alpha. Epsilon alpha, becomes a. And alpha epsilon iota, the diphthong, a, just becomes a. Now this box right here has to do with omicron contracts. It's a little more complicated, but omicrons plus etas with the iota subscript, or aoi or a becomes oi. And we saw that with pleirao, we saw pleirois, pleiroi, things like that. So let me just show you how to apply this chart, and you can see how these rules are applied to create the contracts. Let's apply the rules now to 3 verbs. We'll change the verbs just to learn a few more here, but ganao means I beget. It's an alpha contract verb. Martyreo means I bear witness. Martyreo, like a martyr, right? It's an epsilon contract verb. And skenao means I dwell. It's like in John where it says that the Lord became flesh and dwelt among us. It's like tabernacled, skenao. Okay, it's an omicron contract verb. And to those verbs, we will attach the primary active endings. O, ace, a, amen, eta, usi. And watch what happens when these vowels collide, applying these lovely rules here. Let's work our way through genao using the chart here to show us how the vowels come together. So we have gena, o. So the rule that applies here would be any vowel plus omicron or omega just becomes an omega. So this would just become geno, like this. What would happen here? A plus epsilon iota. Well, there's that one right there. It becomes an alpha with an iota subscript. So like that. And I guess we would also, to get this exactly right, we would have the circumflex over there to show that this contraction happened. Same thing here. Oops, I forgot my sigma there, didn't I? So os. Let's see if I can type a final sigma. There we go. Geno, genos. And then how about an alpha plus an epsilon iota? Well, we just had it. So same thing here. We'll have our iota subscript and a, there we go, like that, gena. So it's just this rule right here. Okay, what about amen? We have an alpha and an omicron. Well, it's an any other vowel plus an omicron rule, so we'll have an omega here. So this would become gan omen, like that. What about alpha epsilon? See the contract here? Gan a eta. Alpha epsilon just becomes an alpha. So we do oops, get my te, like that. Ganata. And what about ausin? Ausin. Well, this is one of those that involves the rule right here down in the lower corner. We have a contract vowel and a diphthong. Okay, so what happens here? The alpha omicron are not the same. So if they're the same, you just like drop one of them, but they're different, so they contract. Alpha and omicron become an omega. And then the omega also swallows up the upsilon, so we wind up with simple O-sine. Now some fun with an epsilon contract. And again, some people debate my definition of fun, but anyway, here we go. Epsilon, omega. Okay, what's our rule here? Any vowel plus with the omega is just an omega. Okay, so that just becomes martyr O, like that. Okay, now let's look at this one. Ace, epsilon plus epsilon iota. Here we have an example of another a contract verb coming into contact with a diphthong. Now it says if they're the same, if the vowels are the same, then simplify. So we have two epsilons. What simplify means is we just drop one, okay? So instead of epsilon iota, we just have simply epsilon iota. So like epsilon iota, like that. That's simplification. These two vowels here, we just dropped one, like that. Okay, and of course we add our circumflex, and I need to add that sigma in there to make it second person singular, martyres. All right, here we have the same thing. So this is pretty easy. Epsilon plus epsilon iota, again, same. These are the same. So we drop one of them. So it just becomes A, like that. What about here? Here we have martyr amen, epsilon omicron. Here we go. Epsilon omicrons becomes U, the diphthong U. So omicron upsilon, and then men are ending. Martyrumen. How about here? We have epsilon. Look at here, becomes epsilon iota. So that's straightforward enough. Martyrete, like martyrete, say it right there, okay. And then down here, eusin. Once again, we have a diphthong here, right? This u. So, okay, we look at the first vowel. What happens to epsilon omicron? It becomes u. Okay, and then once we have u there, then what do we do with this extra u? We just drop it. And so we wind up with something that looks like this, martyr usi. And finally, let's apply the rules to an omicron contract verb here, skenao, I dwell. Okay, so we put the personal endings on, but we have this contract vowel sticking out, so we have these collisions. Omicron plus omega, our big bully rule applies here. it just becomes skeno, like this. Oops, and let me try that in Greek. There we go, skeno. And here we have omicron plus epsilon iota. Okay, here's where we have this whole quadrant here is mainly for omicron contracts, but A, omicron plus epsilon iota, see it here, omicron plus epsilon iota, becomes skenois, like that. So skeno, skenois, and you can probably see the pattern here. It's the same contraction, right? So this will just be skenoi. Forgetting how to type here. There we go. No, I'm not remembering how to. There we go. Skenoi. My Greek typing is a little weak here. Skenoi, skeno, skenois, skenoi. Okay, what happens here? Omicron plus omicron becomes oo. Let's go skene. Let me get the accent there, since that's important to see, because that accent, that circumflex, will tell you contract verb, skene umen. Omicron plus epsilon, right here. So another oo, right? So omicron, upsilon, and then eta. Skene ut eta. Whoops, we don't need the there. That went away, didn't it? So skene uta. And then the last one here, omicron plus omicron. Oh, we have a diphthong here, don't we? So omicron plus omicron, it's the same. So we simplify. We just drop one of the omicrons here. Just get rid of that. And so this will become skene u seen, like that. Okay, so hopefully you can see how these rules are applied. Now, again, it's not going to be super important that you are able to do this like, a master whiz or whatever, but you need to be able to recognize when it has happened and see, okay, oh, that's weird. This is weird because it's an omicron contract verb. Skeno, skenois, skenoi, skene umen, skene uta, skene usin. Now, why these weird vowels? Contract verb, that's why. So that's what we need to be able to recognize. Let's look at a couple in context here, and I want you to look at this phrase right here. We know that we love. Okay, genoskamen, amen, you see that ending? First person plural, right? We know. We know that we love. But we love is not amen here, but omen. Why did we get that big fat omega there? Because it's a contract verb. Agapao, and so the alpha plus the omicron became the omega. And if we forget the rules, it's not that big of a deal. We just need to know that's an alpha contract verb. So agapomen, we love. Remember, we saw that martyreo was an epsilon contract verb. So martyreo. And see how they'll be listed in the dictionary with that epsilon there showing. But here we have the third person singular form, which looks just the same, martyre, except for we have the circumflex. That's because it's an epsilon contract verb. Here is an example of poieo in the wild here. Poieta. Do you recognize that ending? It looks like eta, right? Second person plural. Y'all are doing. Why this strange epsilon iota? Why the diphthong? Because we had an epsilon contract verb, and so the epsilon combined with another epsilon and became this. And you don't need to remember all that goes on to create this. You just need to recognize, oh, it's a weird personal ending because it's a contract verb. So that's all there is to the contract verbs. Remember, all they are is verbs whose stem ends in an alpha, like agapao, in an epsilon, as in poieo, or in an omicron, like in plerao. And when we have this vowel that is attached to the personal endings, there's a contraction, there's this explosion, and it comes together in one new looking ending. But it's really the same ending. The vowels just came together and combined. So again, the secret of these, I think, is to learn to recognize the shapes. Even though you may have forgotten all the detailed rules as to how this became that and turned into that, you can still recognize the shape. And as we go forward, you'll see that that's really the key to Greek. Not memorizing every last little rule, but learning to see the patterns, as I keep saying over and over, because the patterns are there. There aren't that many. We will master this.